Good morning, everyone. I think we should go ahead and get started. So we're running a little bit behind this morning, but so let's just jump right in and get with it. My name is Jeff Brown, and I work for SpringSource on the Grails development team. So I spend most of my time working on helping build the Grails framework. And what I want to talk about this morning is a bunch of the new and exciting stuff that we added to Grails 2, which was, we released Grails 2.0 just a couple of months ago. And Grails 2 includes a whole bunch of really cool new stuff, and I'm going to highlight some of those things over the next hour or so. Before I get started, let me get just a sense for how many of you have done anything at all with the Grails framework, even simple hello worldy kind of stuff. Yeah, okay, very good. So as I'm moving along, feel free to stop me, ask questions. I'm happy to help you with anything that I can. So as I said, my name's Jeff Brown. I work for SpringSource. Here's my email address and Twitter handle and so forth. In the interest of time, there are a couple of things that I'm going to go through fairly quickly here. If you've got questions, I'm happy to speak with you after the session. If you've got questions, speak up, and if it makes sense to address those questions here during the presentation, we will. Otherwise, I'm happy to talk with you after the session. So I want to get into straight away the new stuff that we added in Grails 2. Again, in the interest of time. Over the last few years, we've seen a lot of growth in the Grails community, and one of the ways to recognize that growth is the number of plugins that have been published to the public Grails plugin portal. If you look at this graph, back in 2008, there were about 150 plugins in the public portal, and around the end of last year, there were 600 and something. So you can see the steady increase in the number of plugins in that portal, and that's a pretty good indicator of Grails growth. It turns out that the plugin system is a really important part of the whole Grails scene. If you're doing significant Grails application development, you're going to want to take advantage of the Grails plugin system. So we don't have a whole lot of time today to talk about the plugin system, but be aware of that. The plugin system is a really important part of the whole Grails story. Right, and job trends have continued to go up, so more and more folks are looking for developers who have experience building Grails applications. And that's all good. All right, so what's new in Grails 2? We've added a bunch of stuff to improve the developer productivity experience in Grails 2. Developer productivity has always been really a big deal in Grails. One of the big pieces of value that Grails has to offer is there are just so many things that Grails does that lend to developer productivity. Common tasks that web application developers are used to having to deal with, Grails tries to make all of those things as simple as possible. So I want to jump out to a command line here, and what I want to do is I'm going to create a brand new application. I'm going to type Grails create app, and we'll call it ETE 2012. All right, so what Grails is going to do with this, and I'm using Grails 2.0.3, which was just released a week or so ago. What Grails is doing right now is creating our entire project. Right? So if I cd into this newly created directory, what we'll see is this is the Grails application directory structure. Every single Grails application on the planet is structured just like this, which is really nice. If you're doing consulting work, or even within an enterprise, if you're working on multiple Grails applications, it's really easy to move around from one application to the other because, like I said, all Grails applications are structured pretty much the exact same way. So there's a place for your controllers in a Grails application, there's a place for your domain classes, there's a place for your services and tag libraries and so forth. There's a specific place for all the common artifacts that show up in just about every single Grails application. So when you move to a new Grails application, you don't have to spend a lot of time reading the project documentation or talking to the project leads to figure out things like, where do you guys store your controllers, or where do you store your domain classes? They're stored in the same place in every Grails application, which is nice. All right, I want to create a new domain class in this application, and we'll call this domain class person, com.demo.person. And what I want to point out here is get a sense for, and this particular machine is fairly slow, but get a sense for about how long this command is taking. Right? It's taking a while. The next one will run a little bit faster. There we go. We created a domain class. We'll create another domain class. Right? And this is, so we're executing Grails commands on the command line and asking Grails to do something for us. Right? And you get some kind of sense for about how long that took. In Grails 2, we added this really useful interactive mode. And that's what I'm starting up right now. So I just typed Grails with no arguments and pressed enter. And so now we're in this interactive shell. And I can do the same kinds of things that I can do from the command line. I did that quickly, so I should slow down. If I press tab here, we're going to get auto-completion, which is nice. Right? And then if I type com.demo.company, I'm going to press enter. And this is going to take roughly maybe about the same amount of time it took on the command line, a little bit faster the first time. But subsequent times will be much, much faster. Right? I press enter and it's done almost immediately. Right? So what's going on there is part of the reason that it takes a while to do things like Grails create domain class com.demo.widget. Part of the reason that takes quite a while is it takes a good bit of time to start up the JVM. And it takes a good bit of time to initialize the Groovy runtime environment and so forth. When we're issuing these commands from the command line, every time you type Grails space anything, all of that is happening. You're starting up the JVM, initializing the Groovy runtime, initializing a certain amount of the Grails runtime environment, and all of that takes time. When you're using the interactive console like this, you pay that price only once. Right? As you start it up, you wait a couple of seconds. But now the whole environment is warmed up and ready to go. So when I do something like that, just almost instantaneously, as soon as I press enter, it's done. Right? So that's good. And you get things like, let's edit that person class that I just wrote. So we'll say that a person has a first name and a person has a last name, right? So I want to generate scaffolding for that person class. And I get auto-completion not only on the commands like generate all, right? But if I type com.demo.p and press tab, we'll get auto-completion for artifacts that are defined as part of my project, like the person class, which is nice. And like the create domain class, the first time I run generate all, it'll take a little bit longer. And from that point forward, every time I run generate all, it'll be much, much quicker. Right? So the new console user interface and interactive mode is just really nice. It buys a lot of developer productivity. If we were doing things like running tests, running unit tests or integration tests from the console, we'd see output that looks something like this. So it looks like I ran tests here and a test failed. We see nice information here that tells us what went wrong. There's that line of code that says assert space model.book.title equals the shining. That's a line of code that's inside of the book controller tests. I can see the line of code that relates to the failed assertion. And then we see nice information about each element in that graph. So model.book.title, if you look, I don't have a pointer with me today, but right here where it says book:bookstore, book:1, that's the value of model, right? And model.book is bookstore.book:1. Model.book.title is the stand. So maybe you can see the information that's being represented there. It's just really easy to look at that. Once you're familiar with the structure, it's really easy to look at that and figure out what went wrong. So this test expected this book's title to be the shining, but it was the stand, so the test failed. Now we need to go look at the test and the code being tested to figure out why things are not what we expect them to be. But the console is providing nice feedback to help us figure out which test failed and what went wrong with those tests. So that's good stuff. Comments or questions about any of that? That's good. Yep. In Grails 2, we've got a really nice looking, I think, a really nice looking unit test report. So this is the HTML page that would be generated when you run your unit tests. So across the top there, we see a list of all the tests that ran. We've got a book controller test and a book tests. And apparently the book controller tests had a test that failed. And we see some nice output over there on the right that looks a whole lot like what we just saw in the console. You see what assertion failed, and you can see values of individual elements in that object graph. So the unit test report templates are really nice, I think. We've improved the project documentation template. So for some time, Grails has had a documentation engine in it. So when you're writing plugins, for example, for Grails, you can write documentation for your plugin and then very easily generate pages that look just like this. This is what the Grails user guide looks like, and it's also what plugin documentation looks like. So as an author of a plugin, you write your documentation, and your plugin's documentation looks just like the Grails user guide. So as a Grails application developer, I'm familiar with what the user guide looks like. When I start using your plugin, the plugin that you developed, and look at your documentation looks just like the Grails user guide. It's just a really nice looking documentation template, right? Good stuff. Grails 2 includes some really nice looking error reporting at runtime. So this would show up in the browser, right? So I'm running the application in development mode, and I'm interacting, I'm clicking on links, and something went wrong. And instead of just seeing a stack trace in the browser or in a log file or on the console, this shows up in the browser, right? This is a snapshot of the browser itself. We see what went wrong. There was a missing property exception. The message in that exception says no such property, TITL. So it looks like I made a typo. I meant to type the word title, but I left the E off. So we see nice information about the exception up at the top of the page, and then we see code fragments. This is text that came right out of your source code files. I can see the specific line of code that caused the problem, and it looks like it's line 6 in the book service up there, right? So really nice feedback at development time, at runtime when you're running in development mode. Really nice feedback about what went wrong here. Good looking stuff. In Grails 2, so all along in Grails, we've bundled an in-memory database. And there are lots of benefits to using an in-memory database, in particular in your development environment. From pretty much the beginning of Grails, that in-memory database has been HSQLDB, right? So HSQLDB is a full relational database with a JDBC driver. It has some nice characteristics, and one of those characteristics is it can be run in what's called in-memory mode, which means your entire database is in RAM. Right? It doesn't have to be persisted to the file system at all. And there's some nice aspects to that in your development environment. In Grails 2, we replaced HSQLDB with H2, which the two have a lot in common. So H2 is now the default database that's bundled with in your application in development mode. And one of the things that H2 provides is this console, right? So there's a certain URL that you can point your browser to when you're running your application in development mode. And that URL will show you a page that looks just like this. And this is so this is showing me information about the database. I can inspect the schema. I can execute arbitrary SQL. It's just a really nice console for interacting with your relational database, right, in development mode. And that's really, that's provided by H2. We didn't really write any of that. In Grails 2, we upgraded all of the major libraries that are inside of Grails. So Grails is a full stack framework, right? Grails provides an ORM layer, it provides dependency injection, it provides transaction management. We bundle an application server to make it very, very easy for you to run your application in development mode. So Grails is this full stack framework that addresses all of those and lots more areas of responsibilities. And these are some of the core technologies or core dependencies we have to support a lot of that. And all of these were upgraded in Grails 2. So we upgraded to Spring 3.1.0, I think, whatever was the latest version of Spring at the time that Grails 2 was released. We updated to the latest versions of Tomcat and Hibernate and Groovy. So all of our key dependencies were updated as part of Grails 2. Right. In Grails 1, Grails has really always supported really dynamic reloading at runtime. So you're running your application in development mode, and you're interacting with it in the browser or however you might interact with the application. And you can make code changes while the application's running, and then almost immediately see the effects of those code changes in your running application. Right? Grails has always supported that. In Grails 1, that was implemented using a fairly tedious and complicated class loader approach. And that class loader approach was problematic for a number of reasons. In Grails 2, that was all revamped, and we're using a reloading agent now at runtime, which, so I won't get into the implementation details about how all that works, but what that means to you, the application developer, is the reloading is more robust, and so there are things that we could not reload properly in Grails 1 that are now reloadable in Grails 2, and those include typed service references. So if you had a service in a controller, for example, if your reference to that service was typed as opposed to dynamically typed, if it was statically typed, then certain things would go wrong if we had to reload that class. But that's no longer the case in Grails 2. Typed service references reload just fine. Domain classes can be reloaded, and just arbitrary code that's out under source Groovy and source Java can now be reloaded, which was not the case in Grails 1. So in Grails 1, if some of these things changed at development time, you have to stop the process and then start it back up. And that's not terrible, but it's better in Grails 2 that you don't have to do that. You can make a change to a domain class and then continue interacting with your application and not have to restart the app, which is nice. Yeah?
Is it PermGen a problem at all, or is that totally implementation?
Yeah, PermGen is not a big problem in Grails. For some time, there was some struggle with PermGen issues in Grails. Yeah, PermGen is really not a problem in Grails 2. I mean, it's possible you could run out of PermGen, but it's not terribly problematic. Are you having PermGen issues with Grails 1?
No, I certainly struggled with class loader issues on the applications here before, so I'm just curious. If you're using OSGI or some other framework, it'd be nice to see.
Right. And important to note is this reloading stuff is really is only taking place in your development environment. By default, reloading is turned off in production mode, which makes sense. You're probably not going to be making code changes to your production application while it's running, or you shouldn't be doing that anyway. So reloading is turned off in production mode. When you're running in development mode, so you type Grails space run app, reloading is turned on. That's where you want reloading. Right. Is there another question over here? Yeah.
Oh yeah, just config.groovy reload now too?
Say that again?
Config.groovy reload
now? Config.groovy, I believe, does reload now. Yeah. If that's wrong, file a JIRA. Any other questions? Binary plugins are a new feature in Grails 2. So in Grails 1, as I said before, plugins are a really important part of the whole Grails story. So you author a plugin and you want to share that. Maybe you want to share that just within the enterprise, or maybe you want to share that with the world by publishing it to our public plugin repository, which is really, really easy to do. You simply just type a command and press enter, and assuming all your credentials are in place, now your plugin has been published and anyone in the world now has access to it. But in Grails 1, the way that works is when your plugin is bundled up and distributed, what you're really distributing is the source code for that plugin, which for a lot of things that's not problematic, but for some kinds of use cases that is problematic or even prohibitive. So for example, if you wanted to write a commercial plugin and you wanted to sell it, or for whatever reason you didn't want to distribute the source code to your plugin, you really can't do that with Grails 1. In Grails 2, the default is just that. So you're still distributing the source code for your plugin. But you've got an option to package plugins in binary mode. So you type Grails package plugin -- binary. And what happens is we compile everything and build something that is usable by applications, development time and runtime, but that thing that you're distributing does not include source code. So this is useful. I think mostly where this is going to be useful is commercial plugins, but really it's useful anytime you want to distribute a plugin and not distribute the source code for that plugin. That was not an option in Grails 1, and that is an option in Grails 2, which is really good. Questions about any of that stuff? It's really all the development time stuff that I want to talk about. Some web-related features that were added in Grails 2. In Grails 1, the way to define a controller action is inside of a controller you declare a property whose value is a closure. So you would have something like def save equals closure. Let me show you what I'm talking about there. Save equals closure. That's what a Grails 1 controller action looks like, right? You declare a property in a controller, a dynamically typed property, and assign the value to be closure. In Grails 2, that still works. You can still do that. But in addition to that, you can declare controller actions as methods. Right? So this is a controller action. This is code that's defined inside of a controller. This particular method happens to accept some statically typed arguments. And what Grails is going to do with this is before invoking, or when this method gets invoked, Grails will go look for a request parameter called name and pass the value of that request parameter as the first argument to this method. And Grails is going to go look for a request parameter called age and convert that age to an int, and then pass the result of that as the second argument to this method. So now you've eliminated some code that otherwise would have been inside of this controller action. You might, in Grails 1, you would have had a save action that doesn't accept any arguments, and then inside of the save action you'd have code that's retrieving request parameters and converting them to certain types and so forth. And Grails will do all of that for you in Grails 2. You declare your controller actions as methods like this, and declare statically typed arguments, and what I just said will happen. So the types of arguments that are supported there, at least right now, as of Grails 2.03, is there are, I guess, 17 things that are supported. Those are all 8 primitive types, the 8 type wrappers that correspond to those primitive types, and strings. Right? So there are 17 types that are supported there. And we'll add support for others. Date is one that's notably missing. We should have support for parsing dates and passing them into your controller actions. But as of Grails 2.0.3, the types are the 8 primitives, their corresponding type wrappers, and java.lang.string. Right? So if you had a form in a GSP that looks something like this, where there were request parameters called name and age, when this form submits to the action that you see defined at the top, Grails is going to pass the corresponding request parameter values into that controller action. So it's just that much less kind of tedious code inside of your controller actions. Does that make sense? That's good stuff. The scaffolding in Grails 2 looks a lot nicer than the scaffolding in Grails 1, and we're using a lot of HTML5 stuff to create a better kind of default user experience in the scaffolding. I think the scaffolding in Grails 2 looks really nice. We've provided some new APIs at the web layer to do things like allow you to render a view. But instead of rendering a view and making the result of that rendering, instead of making that part of the response, we'll just return that string to you, and you can do whatever you want to do with that string. So for example, the code at the top here is calling renderer.render and specifying what view we want to render. So it's a view called /email/welcome, and we're passing a model into that view. So that's some data that can be accessed inside of that welcome view. And normally when you call render and say render this view and here's some data, what Grails will do with that is render the view and make that part of the response, right? But what this is going to do is render the view to a string and then return that string. And like I said, you can do whatever you want to do with that string. Put it in an email or do whatever it is you want to do with that string, right? We've also got a link generation API. So often you want to generate a link to some controller action in your application, and you want to do something with that link. Again, maybe you want to put it in an email, or you want to do something with that link. This is a way to do that. So this looks like we're inside of a method called generateLink, and this method is going to return a string that represents a link to the list action in the book controller. Right? So those are APIs that were added in Grails 2. Questions about either of those? In Grails 1, prototype is a JavaScript library, and it's in every Grails application. It's there by default. When you create an application, if you look out under web app/JS, the prototype JavaScript library is there. It's not necessarily pulled into every page, but the library is there as part of your application, and you can use it. What we've done in Grails 2 is we've pulled that out and turned it into a plugin. So you can still use prototype in your Grails applications, but if you want to do that, then the way to do that is to create a Grails 2 app and install the prototype plugin. In addition to doing that, in addition to pulling prototype out and making it a plugin, we developed a jQuery plugin. So you've got a prototype plugin and a jQuery plugin, and it turns out there are a bunch of other JavaScript plugins as well. The jQuery plugin is installed in your application by default. Don't have a whole lot of time to talk about dependency management, but just quickly I'll show you this build config file, which is part of our application. This line right here, what that means in short is that this application, the application that I just created a while ago, has a runtime dependency on a plugin called jQuery, and in particular we depend on version 1.7.1. That's there by default, and if you don't want to use jQuery, you can delete that. You don't have to use jQuery, but it's a reasonable default, so that's what's in place when you create a Grails 2 app.
You also have jQuery mobile as well, or just the regular jQuery?
Just the regular jQuery. I don't know if there's a jQuery mobile plugin or not, but certainly there could be if there's not one. Yep. So the jQuery plugin is installed in your application by default. If you're building an app and don't want jQuery there, just get rid of that one line in your build config.groovy. Some other stuff that was added in Grails 2, we've got nice date parsing, right? So params, in this case, is the request params object inside of a controller. So inside of a controller, you can always refer to a variable called params, and what that is a map that includes all of the request parameters. And what the code here is doing is invoking a method called date, and the date method accepts two parameters. The first is the name of the request parameter that we're interested in. So there must be a request parameter called myDate. And the second argument to the date method is a date format, right? So we're going to parse the myDate request parameter using the date format that's specified there, 2-digit day, 2-digit month, and 4-digit year. Create a date object, and that's what's returned from this date method, is a java.util.date object. Grails 2 supports customizable URL formats. So the default in Grails 2 and the only format supported in Grails 1 is hyphenated URLs. So for example, if you have a controller called Human Resources Controller, and the H and the R and the C are all uppercase, Human Resources Controller, by default, the URL that will map to that controller is human-resources, right? And that's the default in Grails 1, and that's the default in Grails 2. But in Grails 2, you've got an option to support, we support other URL formats. So one format that's supported out of the box that you can turn on just by setting a particular config property is camel case, right? So instead of, no, it's the other way around. The default is camel case. And what's supported now in Grails 2 is a hyphenated format. So instead of human lowercase and then uppercase R for resources, it would be human-resources, right? So camel case is the default, and we support hyphenated URL formats now by setting a simple config property. Grails has supported filters for a long time. It's really simple to write a filter for your Grails application. So you might want, there might be some code that you want to execute anytime any request is sent to a particular controller, and that's so we've supported that for a long time. But when you write a filter, you define where you want it applied. So you might say, I want this filter applied to all requests to the reporting controller and the accounting controller, right? So you've always been able to supply a whitelist, and in Grails 2 you're allowed to supply exclusions. So you can say, apply this filter to every controller that's not the accounting controller, for example. Questions about any of that? It's good. A lot of really cool persistent stuff showed up in Grails 2. So over the last maybe a year, maybe a little bit more, GORM has been abstracted away from Hibernate. So from the very beginning, Hibernate has been the default persistent store inside of Grails. So you create a Grails application, and you're writing GORM code in your Grails application, and under the covers what's happening is all of that GORM code is really just a layer on top of Hibernate. It's all Hibernate under the covers. You don't necessarily have to write any Hibernate code, but it was all Hibernate under the covers. That's been abstracted, and so now we've got this general GORM API and a mechanism for plugging in really any arbitrary store under the covers. And it doesn't have to be a relational database. We've got plugin implementations for things like MongoDB and Riak and Cassandra and Redis. And really, you could write a GORM plugin for any persistence engine that's accessible from the JVM, right? So that abstraction is really important. So now you're not bound, not only are you not bound to Hibernate, you're not bound to relational databases at all. Lots of folks want to build applications on top of key value stores, so-called NoSQL data stores, and GORM allows that now. Right. So there are a lot of plugins supported right now to take advantage of that. This is a list of them. So we've got Redis, SimpleDB, MongoDB, Neo4j, Riak, JPA, and Hibernate, of course, is the default one. If we go back to that build config file that we were looking at earlier, noticed on line 40 there, by default, the Hibernate plugin is installed. Most Grails applications will use Hibernate, but if that's not what you wanted, if you wanted to use one of the other plugins, you would change this and make sure the version number is correct. But Hibernate is installed by default because it's just the most common thing, right? Where queries. This is a really, really cool new feature that was added in Grails 2. So a where query, this is an example of a simple where query. So person must be the name of a domain class that's in our application. Right? So we've written a domain class called person. All domain classes have a static method on them called where, W-H-E-R-E, that accepts a closure as a parameter. So you don't see the source code for that method. If we go look at our person class, right here, there's no mention of where in this class, and we're not extending some superclass where we inherit that method. That method's added to all of your domain classes by Grails. And what one of the things that method allows you to do is to express queries in pretty much any arbitrary Groovy code. So first name equals Bart, that's just Groovy code, right, inside of a closure. And somehow that Groovy code is being turned into a query that can be sent to the database. And that somehow is implemented using Groovy's AST transformation engine. So Groovy makes it really, really easy to modify bytecode at compile time. Right? At compile time, you can do things like look for all calls to a where method on a domain class, and then look at all the instructions inside of this closure and do whatever you want to do in response to those instructions. What Grails is doing with this is at compile time, that code that you see there is being turned into a bunch of GORM code that by default will be turned into a bunch of Hibernate code to send a query to the database. So you don't see any SQL there, you don't see any mention of Hibernate, you see really you're expressing your queries in terms of Groovy code. First name equals Bart is valid Groovy code. All of the native Groovy operators are supported, so you can use not and or and greater than and less than and do just things that feel very, very natural in the Groovy programming language. Now you can use all of those things to express queries. Right? So this second query, it looks like it's going to return all of the person objects whose first name is Fred and their last name is not Simpson. That's just a really powerful, really expressive way to express a query, I think. Yeah?
It's as efficient as the normal method, right?
So the question was, is it as efficient as the normal method? Is that right?
Yeah.
So which normal method are we talking about? Like
defines, blah, 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 by.
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, so instead of person.findAll by first name and last name, is that what we're talking about? This would actually be more efficient because this is all being resolved at compile time. At runtime, when you invoke a dynamic finder like person.findAll by first name and last name, so just for those not familiar, let's see what that looks like in real code. So you can say def people equals person.findAll by first name and last name. Right, so I've got the parameters backwards there, but you get the idea. That's going to return all the people whose first name is Brown and last name is Jeff. That's valid Groovy. That's valid Grails code, assuming that there's a person domain class and that the person domain class has a property called first name and a property called last name. That's a really expressive way to express a query. But this is less performant, not terribly, but this is less performant than the where query mechanism we're looking at because the way this is handled is, notice that there's really an infinite number of these methods, right? Your properties could be named anything, first name, last name, age, and you could have lots of ands and lots of ors. So there's no way for us to know ahead of time what methods you might invoke. There's really just an infinite number of possibilities. So at runtime, not compile time, but at runtime, we have to intercept that method call and then parse the method name and look for certain patterns. Like if the method name begins with findAll by, then we know that's a query. So we parse the rest of the method name, first name and last name. And there might be ands and ors and like, and there's a lot of things that might be in that method name. And all that has to be parsed. There's a lot of stuff happening at runtime to support that query mechanism. And almost all of that is moved to compile time with queries like this. Is that good? Yeah? Any other comments or questions about this query approach? That's really cool stuff. So you're really just writing Groovy code inside of that where block, and those expressions inside of that code are mapped to the criteria that will be part of your query that's sent to the database. So what is this going to return? This is going to return all the persons whose age is greater than the average of all persons' ages. Right? Again, just really expressive options there. Good stuff. For a long time, so in Grails 1, you configure one data source in your application. Really, you can configure as many data sources as you like, but GORM only uses one data source, right? So your application has one data source, and the ORM layer inside of your Grails app, GORM, only deals with that one data source. Pretty early on, maybe 3 years ago or something like that, Burt Beckwith wrote a plugin for Grails to allow multiple data sources to be used by GORM. So you configured as many data sources as you liked. You had to install this plugin into your app, and then you could map certain domain classes to certain data sources. So you could have a bunch of domain classes that are stored in this database, and then another bunch of domain classes that are stored in some other database. In Grails 2, all of that behavior was pulled into the core of Grails, so you don't have to install the data sources plugin anymore. That capability is just there. And the way this works is inside of a domain class, so zip code is a domain class, I've expressed that I want the zip code class to be mapped to the auditing data source, right? So that data source might be talking to a different database than a lot of my other GORM entities might relate to. So the code that you see there at the top is the code that shows one way that I can express what data source I want zip code objects to be associated with. Then all domain classes have this kind of namespace property added to them. So zipcode.auditing.get, what that's going to do is send a query to the auditing data source to retrieve the zip code whose ID is 42. So normally you wouldn't have auditing there, right? You'd have zipcode.get42, and that's going to send a query to the default data source. If I want to send a query to any data source other than the default one, a way to express that is what you see here. Zip code or domain class name dot data source name dot query method after that. So any query method that you can invoke on a domain class, you can invoke on that data source namespace property there. Right? So in the example here, I don't think we're going to see, we're not going to see an example of this here, but let me back up. Right there in the zip code source code, this says data source auditing. All zip code objects are going to be associated with the auditing data source. You can associate multiple data sources with a domain class, and the way to do that is to invoke the data source method, but instead of passing a string to the data source method, which is what we're doing there, pass a list of strings. And now this domain class is associated with all of those data sources. And by default, if you execute a query like zipcode.get, the first data source in that list is the default one. That's what you'll be accessing. And then if you wanted to access any of the other data sources, the way to do that is by explicitly mentioning the data source name like you see here. Right? So domain classes can be associated with multiple data sources. Does that make sense?
Does the same like ORM mapping assume for all of them?
That is correct, right. So you've only got one mapping block. Go back here. There's only one mapping block in your zip code in your domain class, and all of those mappings would apply to all of your data sources. So if you were configuring things like eager fetching and indexes, all your mapping stuff would apply to all of those data sources. Other questions? All right, some other GORM improvements. We've improved abstract-based domain class handling. There's some things that just don't work in Grails 1 with respect to abstract-based domain classes. We've added new forms of dynamic finders that include find or create where and find or save where. So in Grails 1, you might have had code that looks like the code on the top here, where we send a query to the database to look for an object, and if that object is not found, then I want to create a new one. Right? I want to create a user and save it. This code can now be replaced with this code, what find or save where does is it sends a query to the database and returns the object that was found as part of this query. If no object was found, one is created, saved, and then returned. So again, this code is doing the same thing that this code is doing. So find or create where will just create the instance and return it. Find or save where will create the instance and save it and then return that. So sometimes your query doesn't have enough in it to fully create a user object. So let's imagine that the user class has not only a login property, but also has a first name and a last name and a phone number. So I send a query to the database with just the login as part of the criteria. I can't really save an object with just, I can't save a user with just a login, right? So instead of calling find or save where, I might call find or create where. Because when the thing is created, it's not going to be in a valid state where it can be saved. It doesn't have a first name and a last name and an age and so forth. So depending on your use case, one of those may make more sense than the other. The difference between find or create where and find or save where is save where will save the newly created instance and create where it will not. Does that make sense? Very good. Better unit testing. The unit testing story got a lot better in Grails 2. In Grails 1, we provided a base class that your unit tests would extend, and that base class provided a bunch of stuff like mock domain, for example. So if you wanted to mock a domain class to add a bunch of capability to that class to support your unit testing, do things like add support for dynamic finders and add support for a lot of the dynamic stuff that happens at runtime. In Grails 1, the way that you would make that happen is you would call mock domain and tell us which domain classes you want to mock, and then we'd rig up kind of a lightweight version of GORM to support your unit testing. That was inheritance-based, right? You had to write a class, your unit test class had to extend our unit test class, so you could inherit that mock domain method and a bunch of other methods. So that precluded you from using other testing frameworks like Spock, right? Spock is a fantastic testing framework for Groovy. If you're doing any Groovy work at all and you don't know about Spock, look into Spock. It's just fantastic stuff. But to use Spock, the common thing to do is you write a test class that extends a Spock class called specification. In Grails 1, because you had to extend the Grails test case, you couldn't do that, right? You can't extend our test case and extend Spock's test case. So that's one limitation of the Grails 1 unit testing approach. And yeah, we'll just look at this in code here. In Grails 2, the way this works is you write a unit test, and notice there's no parent class expressed there. We're not extending Grails unit test case. We're not extending anything explicitly. So you just write a class and use some annotations that we provided, like test for and mock. So this class is a test for my controller. So there must be a controller in this application called my controller. And that annotation will cause a number of interesting things to happen. That annotation tells us at unit test time that this test class is testing my controller. So we'll add a property to this class called controller, and controller will be an instance of the my controller class, right? And that instance will be rigged up with a whole bunch of dynamic stuff that would normally only be available at runtime. So you've got basically a mocked controller, and you can interact with that controller and carry out your unit tests. What I really want to point out here, or one of the things that's important is, again, there's no parent class is being expressed. One of the things that buys us is now I can turn that test into a Spock test, right? I still have the Grails annotations up there, test for and mock, and but notice this time my controller unit test extends specification, which is a Spock class, right? So now I've written a Spock unit test that gets to use all of the mocking stuff that Grails provides because of the test for and mock annotation. This is something you can't do in Grails 1, again, because my controller unit test has to extend Grails unit test. We couldn't extend specification. Here we're extending specification, so I get to do all kinds of cool Spock stuff, right? This is Spock. These are all Spockisms showing up in that test there. Given some circumstance when I invoke the index action in the controller, then I expect the model to include something called people, right?
What about like runners? Like if you have EasyB, Cucumber, JVM, they use runners instead of extending. Can you do something like that as well?
Absolutely. Yep.
Still just use a JUnit
you would use whatever runner is appropriate for that test framework, right? So if you're talking about JUnit runners, yes, but you could conceive that you might write your own testing framework that doesn't have anything at all to do with JUnit, right? And you've got your own runner that knows how to do whatever it is that your testing framework does. You can use that testing framework that doesn't even exist today in Grails 2. As far as Grails is concerned, what you need to do is use these annotations like test for and mock. That allows us to do everything we need to do to add this controller property and do all the stuff that's needed to support your unit test. But then if your test runner does something in addition to that, like Spock does, fine, we're not getting in the way of any of that. Because of that abstraction that I mentioned earlier with respect to GORM, where we've extracted GORM, Hibernate from GORM, and we've come up with a bunch of GORM implementations like React and MongoDB and so forth. Because of that, we sort of got to take advantage of that in our testing environment. In your testing environment, what happens is an in-memory GORM implementation is plugged into your environment. And we don't really see any mention of it here in both of these tests. We'll go back to the more simple one. It could be that the index action in our controller is doing a bunch of GORM stuff, right? So it's sending queries to the database and doing whatever it is that that particular action does. In our unit testing environment, the GORM implementation that's plugged in there is an in-memory GORM implementation. But it's a real GORM implementation as opposed to the mocked up thing that we were doing in Grails 1, which means your testing environment is much more complete in Grails 2 than it was in Grails 1. In Grails 1, there's a lot of query stuff that just doesn't work. In your unit testing environment, you have to test those things in an integration test. In Grails 2, you've got a full GORM implementation. It just happens to be using a NoSQL code base under the covers, but it's a full GORM implementation. So your where queries will work, dynamic finders will work, anything you can do in GORM will work in your testing environment because we're not rigging up kind of a fake GORM. We're plugging in a real GORM implementation. It just doesn't happen to have a relational database behind the covers. Right? So that's nice. We moved to GitHub, I forget how long ago, maybe 3.5 years ago or something like that. Several years ago, we moved the project to GitHub. GitHub is just, Git itself is just fantastic, and GitHub is even more fantastic. There's a talk later today. I think Scott Chacon is talking about how GitHub works or why GitHub works, something like that. If you don't know anything about Git, I encourage you to look into it. Git is just fantastic stuff. One of the benefits that we got out, well, we got a lot of benefits out of moving to Git, but one of the benefits we got out of moving to Git, and in particular using GitHub, is the pull request mechanism. So if you wanted to contribute a change to Grails, GitHub makes that really, really easy to do. You go to GitHub and you fork our repo and you make whatever changes you like and you push your changes to your own repo, and then with a click of a button, a pull request can be sent to us. And it's not a patch, but you can think of it like that. It's like you sent us a patch, and we can integrate that patch into the framework if we like, and your credentials follow that patch along, as opposed to the way this works with SVN. If you wanted to contribute something when we were in SVN, you would check out the repo, make your code changes, and then do an SVN diff or patch or whatever. You'd create that patch file, and you would send it to us or attach it to a Jira or something. And if we wanted to apply that patch, we apply it. So if I apply the patch and then commit those changes, it looks like I authored those changes, right? SVN doesn't know anything at all about the fact that you wrote that patch. So it's up to me to put a comment in there that says, thanks, Audrey, for contributing that code. The way pull requests work with Git is your credentials follow those commits along, which are just really nice. So it looks like you committed something directly to the repo, which is nice. But because it's so easy to do that, more people do it. It's kind of tedious and complicated to generate a patch and submit it, but submitting a pull request is really simple to do, which means, and one of the things that came out of that is we get more contributions from the community than we used to. So we've had over 100 pull requests on Grails core. I expect that number is probably quite a bit higher now, but we get lots of requests, or pull requests for Grails core and Grails docs, which is our user guide. So if you want to contribute something to Grails and for whatever reason, maybe you're intimidated by monkeying with the code, but you want to contribute, the user guide is a fantastic way to contribute. More and more plugins are showing up in the portal all the time. There's 600 and something plugins out there right now. That's a big deal. And as I said, GitHub has been just a fantastic win for us. I can't say enough good things about GitHub. Just moving to Git was a big win, and GitHub makes it just tons better still. So good stuff. And we are running out of time here. So what I want to do is address, does anyone have any comments or any questions at all about Grails that I can help you with? Yeah.
The recent security thing with Grails 2.0.
Yep.
That's now fixed in 2.03, and what was the kind of the
Yeah, so there was, over the last month or two, there was a kind of a big debacle about data binding and security implications associated with data binding. And the short of it, so we could talk about this for a very long time, so I'm just going to compress this and we can go into more details offline. But the short of it is Grails makes it really, really easy for you to take a map and use that and bind that map to, say, a domain object. And what we'll do is we'll go through the map and find all the keys in the map that correspond to properties in the domain class, and then do data binding with that. So there are security implications with that, because a user could send request parameters that the application developer maybe didn't anticipate. And if the application developer is not careful, they could accidentally be binding stuff they didn't intend to bind. So in Grails 2.0, we improved that by providing a default whitelist that says these are the things that are going to be bound by default, and then there's a way to change that if you want to bind some other things. There's a lot more detail. I'd be happy to talk with you. But yeah, in Grails 2.0, we improved that to make the default thing. What we did was we made the simplest thing to do, we made that safer than it was in Grails 1. Audrey, did you have a question?
I can answer, but I was thinking, are there any gotchas with upgrading from Grails 1 to Grails 2? Anything gotcha?
Now, in the user guide, at the top of the user guide is an upgrading section, and I encourage folks to browse through that. But there's no 1 or 2 or 3 giant things that your enterprise is going to explode if you don't know about. The upgrade path is really pretty smooth. One more question, and then we need to cut it off. Yeah.
A lot of clients, when we say we want to use Grails, a lot of clients are hesitant because the backend language apparently has a lot of performance issues, and this has been true. And I've had a lot of problems actually convincing people to move away from something like Java or Scala to Grails. So what's the take on that, and what's the current situation with that?
Yeah, so I didn't hear every word in the beginning, but I think you're asking about the general performance story in Grails.
Well, actually Groovy and then Grails.
Okay, so the performance story in Groovy is really quite good. So Groovy is not as fast as Java, and there are good reasons for that. But it's more than fast enough for building business applications. The short of it is that performance is really not a problem for Groovy, and certainly not a big problem inside of Grails. Whenever I'm called to look at a Grails application that has performance problems, it's never been the case that we couldn't solve the problem by fixing something in the application. There were no fundamental limitations imposed by Groovy or Grails that meant that were the cause of that performance problem. So the performance story for Groovy is really quite good. So thank you all very much. If you have any questions at all, let me know, and I'll be happy to talk with you. But thank you.